Guys, I think we're going to make a start for the evening, and I'm just going to give a very short introduction, and I'm just going to be handing over to Petra, who's going to be having a conversation with Dr. Alex Ramirez, who's so gracefully given his time tonight to us. So yeah, I just wanted to mention just housekeeping in the beginning. Give a reminder, we are going to be recording, or are recording the talk tonight. So if you don't want to be included in the video with your face, please feel free to turn off your video camera so you don't be recorded. Yeah, so I'm really thankful for Petra's initiative with this. I think with some help from Anvesh as well, and really appreciate it. I know this is a topic that people. Sorry, I have some pet noise in the background. This is a topic that I know that a number of you are really interested in. And yeah, so I'm going to hand it over to Petra, who's studies in this area, and she's going to be introducing herself and Dr. Ramirez. So Petra, I will leave it to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here at this talk about vaccines. Whether you've joined because you have concerns yourself, whether you've heard of some vaccine objections from your friends or family, I'm really happy that you're here to maybe learn something new, to get a new perspective. And yeah, I hope that you'll benefit from this talk as much as I think I will. Now, allow me to welcome Dr. Alex Ramirez, who is a biochemist with a PhD in clinical medical research and immunology. And Alex was a part of the team that developed the widely successful meningitis B vaccine and has since worked on creating vaccines against the dengue fever and influenza virus. Hi, Alex. I'm very pleased that you're here. Alex has also recently published his first book, Top 10 Vaccine Objections, which has inspired this talk. So my first question to you is, what was your motivation, or was your sort of inspiration to write this book?
Thanks, Petra, and thanks for the invite. I'm always, happy to talk to people about this subject. As you know, I've been working with this for a number of years, and I think the book came out of, just having those normal, obligatory conversation starters, where you're anywhere, you're riding the Uber, you're at the restaurant, you're at a party, and it's like, what do you do? What do you do? And when people hear that, we're making a new vaccine against this virus, or we've just made the meningitis B vaccine, they immediately just get very interested about the subject. So I think just from having hundreds of conversations over the years about the subject, I realized that I got pretty good at sort of like explaining and talking about the main questions and doubts that people normally had about vaccines in a very sort of conversational and colloquial way, using cartoons or using analogies in order to like bring a lot of the points across to people. So that's why I decided to actually write a book about it and make it a little bit different.
Yeah, I do believe that science communication is ever more important these days because of so much controversy that surrounds not only vaccines, but since this is the topic of today, yeah. I think before we delve into the more concrete objections that people have and that you've been responding to with this book, I think it would be quite helpful to actually explain and to sort of solidify and demystify the terms. So could you explain to us how vaccines actually work in this sort of short overview?
Yeah, so I mean, with vaccines is there's two things. That vaccines are not just one thing, right? So saying like vaccines is like saying, drugs, like how do drugs work? It's like, it's not really one thing. It can be many multiple things. So they work by different specific mechanisms, but overall, they all do have something in common, which is giving something to the patient to then actually make it immune or resistant against a certain specific disease.
Mhm.
And I mean, this is what you see in the diagram. And again, I find it actually not very useful at all when I'm having, again, these everyday conversations to then go into the specifics of the mechanism of how it's working. You know, you can talk about the macrophages and the antigen presenting cells and, you know, antibodies, etc., and lymph nodes. But at its core, you look in the red box and you're giving something, a substance. They work by different mechanisms. Sometimes it's bacteria or a virus or a parasite vaccine. So they're all slightly different, but it's giving something at that site that will create immunity or resistance at the other end. So that's at its core what vaccines really are.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. I think with this we could go into the sort of side effects that people might expect, because this is one of the most common concerns that people have. It's sort of the vaccine safety. You know, the very common argument: what if I get more sick from the vaccine than from the actual disease? So, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So again, it's difficult to bundle all vaccines in one thing. So it's like, you know, are vaccines safe? Is every single drug, you know, they all have different safety profiles, and again, depending on what they actually are in the contents. But what we do know is that the currently approved vaccines that we use and all the childhood vaccinations, they are actually some of the safest products that exist. And we know that because we actually administer vaccines to a lot more people than we would administer any other drug. So every single year, you know, we vaccinate hundreds of millions of children every single year. And we see very little in the way of side effects or serious long-term, long-lasting side effects or lethality or anything like that. Which is not something you do for every drug. So every other drug, the way it gets tested or administered, it only gets given to those people with, you know, cancer, with diabetes, which will be a small segment of the population. With vaccination rates now in the West, we're up to like 90-95% for a lot of our vaccinations. So that's pretty much almost everyone, and we see very, very few side effects. And again, on average, you know, you can talk about, you know, 1 in 2 million cases or something like that. But again, in the book, I don't really want to go into numbers or stats or, you know, trying to explain to people like, oh, hundreds of children are vaccinated every single year. So what I usually try to do is you know, just compare it to sort of reframe it in their minds to everyday risks that they might be taking, right? So vaccines, if you think that vaccines are generally unsafe, then, you know, you definitely shouldn't get in a car, for example, because getting in a car is way more dangerous than receiving a vaccine. Or you know, you shouldn't have dogs, because there's way more children being injured and killed by dogs every single year than by vaccines. So if you think that they're like something really dangerous, then I usually just give you like a comparable risk in your life, that if you really think it's an unacceptable risk, then, you know, you shouldn't get on buses, or you shouldn't have pets, and you shouldn't do all these things. So I just try to reframe it in something that they can actually relate to.
All right. Yeah, we've got the showing the one of the illustrations from the book, exactly what you mentioned with seat belts, and the fact that cars can be more dangerous than vaccines, and are actually. Why do you think people have these concerns about, especially about vaccine safety and side effects? Where did all of this come from? Since vaccines are one of the best things that, one of the best tools that we have to combat disease in modern medicine.
Yeah, it's really strange. I think one of them is lack of information. So again, I don't think there's enough being, communicated to parents and to people in general about what vaccines are and how they work. And B, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So you just need to Google vaccines. I think if you just Google vaccines on the internet, you'll come up with a bunch of like myths and misinformation that are actually doing, causing some of these concerns.
Yeah, yeah. I think, well, in your book, you talk a lot about some of your fellow conversationalists expressing dislike for pumping their bodies full of chemicals. Could you sort of summarize how, sort of what arguments you give against this sort of saying?
Yeah, so I mean, this is quite a common one where people are just generally distrustful and of chemicals, right? And again, bundling chemicals on their all one thing is just kind of like a crazy thing to do. But everything's a chemical, right? So from your salt table, your sodium chloride to the ethanol you drink in your beer. So everything pretty much that we come in contact with is a chemical. Even ourselves, our DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. It's not. Everything's pretty much a chemical. But again, in the book, I always try to frame it in terms of familiar things to them. And one of the things I talk about often is it's tattoos, for example, because tattoos are basically man-made chemicals that get injected into people, every single day. And you don't get like a single injection, but you get maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of injections if you have a tattoo of decent size. And the most people do not seem to have a problem. And again, if you search on the internet, there isn't all these conspiracies associated with the chemicals you would inject yourself with, these man-made chemicals you would inject yourself with, if you get a tattoo or something like this. And again, the industry is way less regulated than the pharma industry, and the side effects are way more common than you would get for vaccines. So that's one of the ways I try to relate it to them. Often these people who have these objections, they often have tattoos themselves, right? So they sometimes turn around and they go, well, okay, I hadn't really thought about it like that. Like I wouldn't inject myself with man-made chemicals, but actually I have.
Yeah.
The other main or not main but specific rather concerns that people might have about these chemicals are things that they have read about, and you can see in this illustration as well. It's the use of formaldehyde in vaccines and the content of mercury. And again, these are within the vaccine industry. Mercury is used as a derivative called thimerosal, which is an organomercury compound that's quickly degraded in the body and it just goes away. But actually, due to these concerns, a lot of the vaccines have actually taken it out of the excipient list. So a lot of the vaccines you get nowadays, they actually don't contain any thimerosal. And if you're really careful and you like really care about that, there is a way you can get your full vaccination schedule without any thimerosal at all. But even again, trying to reframe it for people in terms that they can relate to, the mercury content, it's so low that you're more likely, or you get a greater mercury exposure to your body from eating fish such as tuna. So if you eat a can of tuna, you would get more or less the same mercury exposure than you would get from a vaccine. Or like raw sushi, like a big tuna steak, something like that. That would contain similar amounts of mercury. And the formaldehyde, Formaldehyde, again, it is used for some of the vaccines. It's a fixing agent, which has two functions. One, it like kills and deactivates some of the viruses in killed vaccines or in inactivated vaccines. But it also it keeps the shape of the proteins, and that's needed because you want that for immune recognition. Your immune system has to recognize that it's the same protein. So that's used, but what they don't know, or they don't tell you in a lot of these internet conspiracies, is that they use the formaldehyde and moved from the formaldehyde. So the only would tend to get in a vaccine is the residual trace amount of formaldehyde that wasn't, removed completely from the process, because no manufacturing process is sort of 100% efficient. And again, to relate that to the public in a tangible way, that trace amount of mercury that you end up with in the vaccine is about the same content you would find in an apple, right? So if you're like really concerned about formaldehyde exposure, then you should like be really concerned about not ever eating apples or bananas or things like this that also contain formaldehyde.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems that quite often it's really about a frame of mind and sort of different analogies you use to explain these things. I think I quite liked another chapter, which was which summarized the concern of my generation, of the sort of youth. We're young people. We don't really need vaccines. We don't need to be protected. We have strong immunity. And I think you quite, in the chapter, you explain it really well.
Yeah.
So,
So that is another no, that's a different illustration.
oh, sorry. Yeah.
But that is another common argument I get from people saying like, well, I'm young and fit. I don't need the vaccine right now because I'll just fight it off. I'm strong and healthy, and I don't need to get the vaccine because I'll just I might get sick for a few days, but I'll just live through it. And that's, like I said, that's a common argument, but it kind of misses the whole point of how vaccines actually work. So vaccines are a preventive measure, and the way they actually work is by generating herd immunity within a population. And you might have heard this term, especially recently. And all it means is that enough members in a given population become immune to the disease so that the disease cannot easily spread around and infect everyone else. And actually, to generate herd immunity, if you just vaccinated like the old people, like the ones who need it, you would never generate herd immunity through this method, because you would need you need about 70, 80, 90%, depending on the pathogen, for herd immunity. And obviously the old and the weak people, they would only be like 20% of the population. So to actually generate herd immunity, you need also to vaccinate young people. But more than that, it's actually young people who protect the old people and the young people, like the infants, the babies, and people who are the most at risk. So actually vaccines, because they work by activating your immune system, and because the immune system of older people, frail people, sick people, their immune system is weaker and is not as good. So actually getting them the vaccine is not always the best and the only method to protect them. And often the best way to actually protect them from getting sick is by vaccinating all those people who rightly claim that they are young and healthy and they have a fully working immune system. The best method is to give them the vaccine, and use their fully working immune system to create like a protective barrier against this like really at-risk individuals. Yeah, so what I normally tend to tell people who say that is like, well, that's fine, but you know, it just depends on how much you care about actually containing the disease and about like infecting others and about like society as a whole. And if you think that that's like worthwhile, then you should also get vaccinated.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always that pertinent point of those young people actually becoming old one day and having gone through the vaccination process and being protected themselves when they're in older age.
Exactly.
Yeah, precisely. I think along with this, we could maybe discuss the argument of natural immunity and how some people see vaccines as something that can potentially weaken their immune system. In fact, if they don't strengthen it by allowing it to combat the diseases. So how do you reply to that?
Yeah, this is a similar argument, but it's people that I've had conversations with, and they say, well, actually, you know, I prefer to like get the full immunity, like the full immune response that you would get from a wild type virus, because it makes my immune system stronger. Like whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and you know, you need to like challenge the immune system with like the real thing, and then you get a more potent immune response, immune memory. In the book, I actually say that this argument was one that I struggled with initially when I first heard it, because it is true that you would get a more complete immune memory and a more complete immune response if you're exposed to the live virus or the live pathogen, bacteria, parasite, whatever it might be. So it is true that it's a more complete response than if you just get the vaccine. But then I realized that their whole argument basically relies on them getting exposed, right? So like they can only generate this superior immunity if they actually get exposed, which means that there's virtually no advantage to doing that. And there's actually a lot of disadvantages to not getting the vaccine, because if you were to get the vaccine and then you get exposed, then you would still generate that full immune memory. So you would generate your vaccine immunity, and then if you do get exposed to the virus later on in life, or you know, a couple of months later, at that stage, you would then generate that full range of immune responses against the pathogen, just like you would from like a naive exposure.
Yeah. I suppose that would be without all the nasty side effects of getting really sick and going through.
Yeah, in a much safer way, you know, without you having potential complications or ending up in hospital or infecting other people along the way. So it's just basically, it would get you to the same place, but one way would be without, you know, in a much safer, much like hassle-free way.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think a lot of people here might be quite interested in the sort of very important and very common topic these days, which is COVID. And right now, we're already quite a few countries are already vaccinating their citizens by vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna. And I think at first it would be good to maybe talk about what the differences between the COVID virus are, sort of between the COVID virus and the different viruses are. So if we take the example of maybe COVID-19 and the influenza virus, how would you explain the differences, especially when, you know, people have been comparing COVID to the flu for, well, ever since we've been in the pandemic?
Right. So COVID, so I'm not an expert on coronaviruses or COVID viruses. I'm an expert in making vaccines. I did become somewhat of an expert in influenza because we had a contract to develop an influenza vaccine. That was a project that ran for a number of years. What I can tell, for example, COVID to like normal flu season, is that there's been a lot more deaths, a lot more hospitalizations, a lot more severe illness from coronavirus compared to influenza. As to why this might be, I've read many like different hypotheses. I think one of the main ones is that actually for influenza, because it does happen, you get like a seasonal epidemic almost every single winter. There's a lot of people who already have some degree of immune memory or some little cross immunity with previous strains or from previous years, or who've had flu in their lifetime at some point. So there's already a lot of people who are protected against influenza. Whereas this coronavirus is quite new and just not many people have pre-existing immune memory against something that's completely new. So it's more likely to affect a lot more people in that first wave.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you compare the vaccines or the way we would go about, or scientists would go about manufacturing vaccines against COVID and influenza, because the influenza vaccine, there are a few problems with it. The efficacy of it can range from, I don't really know the percentages, but it can range quite heavily. So how do the vaccines actually compare?
That's a good question. It's also like maybe like a difficult question. What happens with flu, the reason the vaccine efficacy is so broad, and it can be really bad. So it goes, some years the vaccine efficacy for flu can be as low as 25%. Some years it can be as good as 95%, close to 100. And that's because the problem with flu is that it actually mutates all the time. So it mutates every single year or every 3 to 5 years. So the flu shot that you got last year may not protect you against the flu from this year. And that's why generally they try to give out the flu shots every single winter, and you have to get your flu immunization every single year. So that's the problem with flu. It's just its high sort of mutation rate, and the reason like the vaccine efficacy is so low some years is because the vaccine strain that they put in the vaccine, so the flu that they put in the vaccine actually doesn't match the flu that's in the environment, either because it's already mutated or because they couldn't predict the contents like a year before, which is when they have to start making the vaccine. So when there is a mismatch between the virus in the vaccine and a mismatch with the virus in the environment, that's when you get really low vaccine efficacy. With COVID, as far as we know, there's this one type, COVID-19, and I know right now there's been some like new variants that they found, in the UK and the South African strain. What they have said so far is that the vaccine should still work for those variants. I don't think it has as high rate mutation as influenza. So I don't think it's likely to become, like the next influenza or the next like we're gonna get a new COVID every single year. But
how is it possible that the flu mutates so much more than other viruses like COVID?
Yeah. What drives the mutation rates of viruses is it's many things. So like it's for example the machinery of the virus, and like how the fidelity of replication of the virus. So like each time it makes a copy of itself, how true the copy of the virus is. And for some viruses, that's really good. And for some other viruses, just their machinery that makes themselves, like, it makes a lot of mistakes, which introduces a lot of mutations. Flu also mutates a lot because it has a lot of different hosts. So, you know, birds can get flu, almost every bird, like cats, people, pigs. So when you have a great number of hosts, actually that increases the number of genetic changes that can happen. There's that, and there's selective pressure. So again, you know, given the vaccines and humans being sort of like immune or used to influenza over many years, that actually creates a selective pressure for successful new influenza viruses to then like propagate and replicate. So yeah, I mean, but that's not true for all viruses. And I mean, and I think, you know, things like flu and HIV are like the exceptions. For the most case, something like polio or smallpox, you know, we've been able to almost completely eradicate them using effective vaccines because they don't change as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I think it would be good if we maybe talked about the COVID vaccines a bit, and especially a lot of the questions that I've been getting as well were in terms of the amount of time that it took to develop these vaccines. Why was it so short, and how come these vaccines, how do we actually know that these vaccines really work?
I mean, the reason it's been so short, it's a number of things, right? So actually it hasn't been crazy short because, you know, we were just talking about the flu virus, and like I said, every single year they sort of adapt the flu shot to the seasonal strain of influenza. So they actually do make a different flu shot every single year. So every single year they're able to come up with like a new version of the vaccine. That one, again, it's achieved and it's quick because they already have all the infrastructure in place, and they only have to change, you know, the input at the beginning, and then everything else just kind of flows naturally. The reason this vaccine has been so quick, it's been because, okay, so normally people say that on average, it will take you 10 years to develop a vaccine, right? To go from conception to the clinic, it just takes about 10 years. And that's the average of like many development programs. And again, taking everything into account, you know, parasites, bacteria, viruses. And there's usually a lot of challenges, but one of the main ones is the money that it takes to develop these things, and the sort of the willingness of people to do these things. And obviously those two things have been accelerated with COVID, right? Where a lot of money has been pouring in because how much it's costing the economy, and also the willingness of people to actually drive the process forward, you know, in a very rapid way. The third factor, which is probably the most important, is the technology. So this vaccine it's a brand kind of like new technology. It's going to be the first RNA/DNA vaccine that we're going to be employing. And there's no other vaccines that actually use this technology. So in the beginning, I said that, you know, that vaccines can be many things. And I think the idea actually, you know, when I was researching the book, the idea that people have about vaccines is like the really basic thing, you know, it's like, oh, vaccines are like a little bit of the disease that you give to people, and, you know, it's not enough to make them sick, but it's a little bit of the disease, and that's sort of like, it's enough for you to generate immune memory, but it doesn't make you sick, or it only makes you sick a little bit. And that's what a vaccine is. I mean, that's what a vaccine used to be, like in the 1800s, you know, this is like 200 years old. And we've from then to now, we've gone through many generations from those live vaccines to live attenuated to like killed vaccines to, you know, to things that are now, a lot of vaccines are just like purified single proteins from the virus or from the bacteria. Like it's not a whole bacteria, it's just like very, you know, targeted portions that have been produced and purified. And now what we're going into is like not, we don't even have to like grow the pathogen. We don't have to culture the virus. We don't have to you know, even express the protein or purify. We're just now giving like the DNA or the RNA, which is like the instruction on how to make the virus or the viral protein in this case. So that actually cuts down on a lot of work. So that actually cuts down on 90% of the work that would usually have to be done, which is yeah, which it's really incredible. And what can happen is that if this vaccine proves to be successful, it might actually change the way all vaccines are made. So it's possible that in the future, all vaccines will be DNA vaccines or RNA vaccines, because it's a much, you know, it's a quicker, kind of like cheaper, rapid process of making vaccines. So it's a very exciting time.
Yeah. What part of the technology actually makes it quicker and cheaper?
So like I said, so if you compare it to, say, the flu vaccine, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to make COVID in the way that you make flu vaccines, you would have to get the virus, isolate pure virus from a patient, and then find a way to grow the virus in the lab, and to grow it, you know, to make it replicate, like either in human cells or in eggs or in some sort of media. You would have to do all the experiments to say, okay, this is like a good way to actually make more of the virus, so we can make, you know, liters and gallons of the virus. So you would have to find all of that out. Then you would have to like grab all that virus and then like kill it, deactivate it, make it safe, then purify it, and then dose it out, and then that's like the vaccine. Right now, we don't have to do anything. Like all we did is like we isolated the virus, we took the genetic sequence of the virus, so we sequenced the virus to tell us like the full genome of the virus, and then we created synthetic RNA or DNA based on that sequence that came out of a computer code, and that's it. Basically, you put it in a vector, and that's what you're injecting now. So it's you don't have to like make the virus at any stage. You don't have to grow it. You don't have to purify it. You don't have to inactivate it. So it's like much safer and much quicker in many ways.
Yeah. We should just clarify that a vector is anything that the virus or the vaccine is rather suspended in. It's like a packaging.
Like a vehicle of sorts. Like
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One of my favorite conspiracy theories about RNA vaccines was that they can change your genetic code. Have you heard of this one?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of it, and again, just like I said, the book came about from you know, people knowing that I work with vaccines, and then, you know, they immediately like ask me all their questions or things that they know about. Nowadays with COVID and the COVID vaccine, I've been getting a lot of texts and emails and YouTube links from everyone I know saying, oh, you know, you work with vaccines, like, what do you think about this? So basically, it's basically impossible. Like mRNA is ubiquitous in the human cell. There's mRNA in every single cell. We make it all the time, and it's degraded all the time. So like the cells know very well like what to do with it and how to deal with it and how to degrade it completely. And basically it's also a very unstable molecule, so it like doesn't last very long. It actually, one of the main obstacles to actually getting the RNA vaccines to work was to stabilize the RNA enough for it to like make it actually, you know, first of all be stable in the vial, and then be stable and for it to enter the cell and not get degraded. It's actually a very fragile kind of molecule. So there's no way that it can, you know, stay in your cell long enough to like change your genes or anything like that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And I think, well, RNA vaccines have been around for a while, haven't they? As in the technology itself has started, sort of the development of the technology has started some, I think in a sort of earlier conversation, you were saying some 10 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, they've actually been working on this, and there's a lot of like research publications that you can find where they've vaccinated, you know, animals and things. And again, part of the reason why this COVID vaccine came about so quickly is because they had already done a lot of the research for a candidate vaccine, RNA vaccine, for a related virus, a related coronavirus, which was the MERS and the SARS virus. So yeah, that has been around for a long time. But yeah, one of the main challenges with the technology was actually, yeah, like getting the RNA to like be stable, and like getting the RNA to like actually be going inside the cell so that it can be translated into proteins.
Of course. And I think my last question before we can open a Q&A, so after I ask this question, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask Alex anything that is on your mind. But before then, this is slightly different. Do you think, so many countries sort of seeing the trends in the anti-vaccine movement and in sort of lower compliance with vaccines, many countries started making vaccines obligatory. What do you think about that? Do you think it's the right way to go, or do you think there are other ways to increase vaccine compliance?
Again, I mean, I think the best way to increase compliance, or one of my favorite ways, is through communication, right? So increasing that level of communication and that level of trust. And it's, you know, I think sometimes scientists or doctors or people who are pro-vaccine, they can be very dismissive and sometimes like insulting, you know, towards like people who generally might have concerns out of ignorance or out of whatever reason, you know, saying like, oh, okay, like just shut up, or like the data speaks for itself, or you don't know what you're talking about. So that's again one of my big motivations for writing the book. That, you know, I thought, okay, there is a way to explain a lot of these concerns, and with things that they can actually relate to in real life without having to understand a lot of the science, right? But again, I mean, there is precedent for legislating for things that can protect people, protect themselves, and protect others. There's like the story about seatbelts, where, you know, like now you're legally required to wear a seatbelt if you're driving around. Again, both for your own protection and for the protection of others. So I think there's at least precedent to you know, to legislate, to say that these are things that you have to do if you want to, you know, take part.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for answering all my questions. I hope everyone who's attended has enjoyed this. And if you have any questions right now, then as I said, please feel free to unmute yourself and just ask away. Or if you're shy, then you can always just write a question in the chat and I can read it out.
I would have a question. First of all, thank you very much for this, Petra and Alex, both of you. This was very informative and very interesting. You pointed out that in order to get herd immunity, we would need to vaccinate also the younger people, but now we're starting this campaign with vaccinating the elderly and the vulnerable. What do you think, like, how many, like, what's the percentage of elderly people that we need to vaccinate, or like in which, who needs to be vaccinated first? What would be the best thing to do, like, in order to get a grip on this situation as soon as possible? Also, keeping in mind that the economy is at hold in many places.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the true answer is like nobody knows, right? Because even when they do the trials, some of them have included elderly people, but they haven't really seen if older people in general get the same successful like vaccination efficacy as younger people would, right? I think the reason they're doing that for COVID is because there's also a differential in terms of the mortality and the hospitalization rates, right? Where most, like 90% of the mortality and hospitalization is happening in those people that are older. So I think that's why they're taking that strategy of starting with those. I think if that wasn't the case, for example, if there was like an even distribution of like between ages, so like you know, you were just as likely to die from it or just as likely to end up in hospital from it if you are in your 20s, then they wouldn't start with the oldest. They would just start with, you know, everyone, probably yeah, the people who the essential workers and the people needed to like restart the economy.
We've got another question in the chat. Hello, thanks for the talk. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the strategy of prioritizing vaccinating with 1 dose more people versus vaccinating less people with 2 doses.
Yeah, I mean, that's another interesting question, right? Because again, the trials for vaccine efficacy, they were never done for 1 dose, right? So they only know when they say this vaccine is 90% efficient, what they mean is like after 2 doses, this vaccine is 90% efficient. Now there is some protection after the first dose. And again, I think the only reason they're doing this is because they don't have enough doses for everyone and immediately available. So it's one way to go of saying like, well, we'll just give, you know, let's say 1 dose, it's 60% protection. So we would rather give 60% protection to 100% of the people than 90% protection to 50% of the people. So it's just a calculated risk they've taken, and I'm sure, you know, they've taken this, you know, using like computer models, maths, or something that hopefully makes sense.
Yeah, so it's sort of taking into account all the different facets of the situation, as you said, calculating the risk. Yeah, there's also another question about the differences between the Pfizer, Moderna, and Oxford vaccine. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah. So the Pfizer and the Moderna and sometimes it gets bundled in, like Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna vaccines. They are very similar, those two products. They are both mRNA vaccines, RNA vaccines. So RNA is a nucleic acid that's closely related to DNA, but it's an intermediate messenger molecule between DNA and protein. So what actually gives you the immunity is the protein. And what they're doing is giving you the messenger, the mRNA, that will create the protein. And then the protein, once it's created inside the cell, will give you the immunity. The other vaccine that's more popular in the UK, which is the Oxford Astrazeneca vaccine, that's a DNA vaccine. So again, they're very related, very similar products, but that one has a vector, basically a carrier, which is an adenovirus, adapted adenovirus, which will carry the DNA into the cell, and then the DNA will make mRNA, and then the mRNA will make the protein. So they are related technologies. There are some slight differences, and also in the trials, there is at least one trial for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that wasn't as good. So they do have like overall 90% efficacy with that product, but that's an average of different trials they ran, and there was one where they only had about 60%. So it seems like the RNA products from Pfizer and Moderna have better efficacy, but they also have some downsides, which is that they have to be completely frozen. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier, that the RNA molecule is actually very unstable, like very fragile. It degrades very easily. So it has to be completely frozen. And actually, in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, it has to be frozen not just at normal -20, but it has to be frozen at -70 degrees, which creates a logistics nightmare for distribution and immunization. And the Oxford AstraZeneca only has to be stored at normal fridge temperature, like 4 degrees. So you kind of have to take all of that into account. But I mean, safety-wise and overall purpose, I think they should be very similar outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Another question that we have is, do you think we will end up with quicker lead times and therefore hopefully greater efficacy for yearly flu vaccines as a result?
Yes, I mean, as a result, I'm not quite sure what they mean as a result of what. But
if
you mean as a result of this new way of making vaccines, sort of these DNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines, I am 100% sure that these yearly flu vaccines will become mRNA vaccines, RNA vaccines. If the COVID vaccine works, then we will use that technology to make flu vaccines, and they will be much quicker and much cheaper as well.
Another question we've got in the chat is, could you please elaborate on the vectors used in RNA DNA vaccines? Thank you.
So again, for the RNA ones, which is the Pfizer and the Moderna one, they're basically just liposomes, or what they called nano liposome particles, stuff like that. And what it basically is, it's a mix of like oils and cholesterols that will so if you imagine like when you drop olive oil into water, and then it forms this sort of balls, these like little vesicles inside the water. That's basically what it is. Like you just drop your RNA inside that protective sort of like oil capsule, and that's what will actually carry it, through the tissue and inside the cell. For the Oxford Astrazeneca vaccine, there is actually it's an adenovirus that they have adapted from a chimp, and they've made it so that it's completely safe. So it's like a non-replication. It cannot replicate. It cannot do anything. It's just basically like the shell of this chimp adenovirus, and inside this shell is where they put their DNA vaccine.
All right, thank you. Okay. What's the recommended wait time for the second vaccine for it to be effective in protecting you from the virus? I suppose this relates to the second dose of the COVID vaccine.
Yeah. So I think in the trials, it varied. I think it's between, but all vaccines, this was obviously the way they designed the trial, it's in line with most existing vaccines. So it's about 4 to 6 weeks apart is generally what's recommended between doses. Mm-hmm. Now, will it work, 8 weeks apart? Probably. They don't really know, but it's likely. I mean, your immune memory does tend to last quite a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's another message about, another question about blood types, whether they actually can affect vaccines' effectiveness or efficacy.
Not really blood types. So blood types and that type of like serotyping, people classification of different types of blood, as in like O negative, AB. That's like a very sort of old system. Before we knew a lot of the differences that people actually have in their immune system and stuff. So probably not blood types, but definitely something that is called haplotypes. And the haplotypes are basically the genes that determine your immune system. So not everyone has the same immune system, not everyone has the same immune response. And that is likely to generate some natural variants. Just like some people would be naturally, like able to fight off COVID when some other people would not be able to fight it off. That sort of like natural difference in your immune system will also play out in vaccine immunity. But it's generally, not a big issue.
Could you just explain what a haplotype is?
So like I said, basically it's the genes that determine which immune system you end up with.
We'll take a few last questions. So I know that Anvesh wanted to ask something, and then there are 2 questions in the chat, and then I saw Vita's hand as well. Yeah, okay, Anvesh, ask away.
Thank you, Alex, for joining us, and Petra for conducting this. Hi, Alex. I'm a PhD student from Imperial College. I'm working on graphene-based biosensors. Indeed, I think we are living in the unprecedented time. COVID vaccine will change the way we'll look at the viruses, and for sure, I think it will put the foundation for next generation vaccine production, I guess. And the parallel I can find for the COVID vaccine development and the production is, I think, World War II atomic bomb development. It was like at that level, I think, and scientists has done, I think, fantastic job, I guess. So I come to the question. I have 2 questions, simple one. First is, do you know what are the natural factors that causes the mutation? That's the first one. And if you want, I can answer the second one, or you can answer first as you wish.
I mean, in terms of natural factors that causes the mutation of the virus, I assume you mean. I did discuss them a little bit earlier. And again, it tends to be like host, selective pressure, and also the machinery of the virus. So like the virus itself has enzymes, polymerases, retrodnases and other enzymes that basically copy the virus itself. And depending on how good these enzymes are at copying the virus, some of them are like very good. They make like a copy of the virus that's 100% the same. Some of the other enzymes are by design, I guess, not as good at copying the virus. And that's why it would like introduce mutations.
Thank you. And the second one is something I have read recently, that is it true that life will be impossible without parasites?
I mean, I don't know if it would be impossible, but it would be, there's many studies that show that you can get some benefits, especially with regards to like allergies and autoimmunity from being exposed to parasites. It would certainly be impossible without bacteria, for example. Like all the bacteria that colonize us, the biodiversity of like your skin and the microbiome in your gut. I think, that would be pretty impossible to live without those. Parasites, I'm not so sure.
I think we can take the question from Petra. And unmute yourself.
Okay. Hi. First off, thank you very much, Alex and Petra, for the talk. I just have a quick question. Based on the conversation I had with a few friends and families regarding the COVID vaccine, one of their major concerns was that it's a newer vaccine, so there's not much long-term track record yet. So they are very concerned on the safety. So how would you address this concern? Basically, they would take the vaccine, but just not yet.
I mean, so one way to address it is that, people say like, oh, they skipped over the testing, or they didn't test it as well as other vaccines. They actually did test it, the same as other vaccines, just in compressed time windows and sometimes simultaneously. But they have done, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 human trials for this vaccine. And the other thing to know is that, you're saying like, okay, we'll take it, but not just yet. And even at these early stages of the immunization program, because it is a global problem, they've already vaccinated some odd 40 million people. So like 40 million people have already taken it. Like, it's not like you're the first one, right? So it's like 40 million plus, and every day is like an extra 3 to 5 million. So, if when they by the time they get their vaccine, it'll probably be like, well, 100 million people have taken this vaccine. That's got to be, at some point, you can only say it's probably fine.
So I think we're running a little over time, but there are still a few questions in the chat. So what we can do is, if you want to leave, then thank you for attending this talk. And I think we could still answer the last questions, which are in the chat, up to one posed by Honey. So I think, okay, the next question was, why were Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people more affected by COVID? Was it because they were mainly found in the frontline work, or was it their DNA?
I mean, I haven't seen anything to suggest it was their DNA. I haven't seen any research that says, that because of their immune system or something, they're more affected. So I think, they probably will end up being socio-economic factors at play, whether it's, health, their access to healthcare, obesity rates in these communities, the jobs that they tend to do, the necessity of like having to work, maybe not being able to stay at home for such a long time. So I think it'll turn out to be socioeconomic factors.
Thank you. The next question was, they say that after being exposed to COVID-19 virus, immunity does not last very long. Do you think that the way these vaccines are made will allow people to develop a proper and long immunity? And is this correlated to a specific immune response?
They say that after being, it does not last very long. I mean, the way the vaccines are made, I don't think that there's anything about the way the vaccines are made that will like change the length of the protection that you will have. What it will be more targeted. So when you get exposed to the wild type virus, you end up making an immune response, not just to the, let's say, the target or the vulnerable part of the virus. You end up making an immune response to many other things. And the vaccine that it's given, it's kind of like being very specific in what it's targeting. So it's targeting this like spike protein from the COVID virus. And the spike protein is important because it is the spike protein that the virus uses to enter and infect the cells. So with the vaccine, you're getting a specific immune response just to the spike protein. So in that way, it will be more targeted. I don't know if it means it will last longer.
Thank you. John asks, generally, would mRNA vaccines be more effective than DNA vaccines because mRNA is nearer to translation?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say, and I think it again, it depends. Even after this experiment, let's say, or even after these vaccines, we won't know because, like I said, the vectors are different. So the amounts of mRNA or RNA that you might have in the cell after either injection, I don't think that's been measured, and it's difficult to say. But this will be like an interesting thing to find out.
There's another question from Javi. Some people have mutations that are believed to give higher resistance to SARS-CoV-2. Could it work the other way around? Human mutations making vaccines less effective?
Human mutations making vaccines less effective. Yes, I mean, there's people, basically any mutation you might have that makes you not have a fully functional immune system. And this is the case in many, people who they have some genetic condition and they have some severely compromised immune system. Then yes, like because vaccines work through your immune system, they work with your own immune system. If you have a faulty or some genetic mutation that means your immune system is not as good, then yes, the vaccine will be less effective for you.
And I think last question to then wrap this up. There have been reports that many people are getting the COVID twice. How long do you think these vaccines will protect against COVID?
I mean, again, this is a very similar question to the one we had maybe like 2 questions ago about the length of protection. Yeah. We don't know, and I think a lot of these reports I have seen about people getting COVID twice, they haven't been fully not scientifically rigorous. Where like you're not really sure if they got COVID twice. A lot of them hasn't been like a double confirmation with reliable testing. A lot of them you don't know if it's like they had COVID and they never quite cleared it, and then they had like like COVID symptoms again because they weren't able to clear the infection in the first place. So you don't know if they got it twice or if they just had the same infection, more like chronic long term, which has been happening in some people. Or they don't know if like it was definitely COVID, like maybe the first time, maybe they got flu and they were just pretty sure they had COVID. And then the second time, they got it again, so they got tested, and then this time it was COVID. So these reports that I've seen, none of them seem like very well substantiated. But yeah, that's a question that we'll have to see over time, how long the vaccine is going to last.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who's attended. I just want to point out that you can get Alex's book at Waterstones. It's there, it's available, you can just order it. And thanks for the talk, Alex. I think you've made a lot of things much clearer for all of us. And yeah, I hope that, guys, if you had any doubts and concerns, they're just much less in your mind, they got explained. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for the invite, Petra. And yeah, the book, it's available on Waterstones, WH Myths. That's if you live in the UK. Barnes and Noble if you live in the US. Or if you live anywhere else, you can always buy it from Amazon.
You might get some requests for autographs.
So thank you, Alex. This is the book. It's with me for some time. Team has read it. Veda, I guess, and Petra also has read it. So
yes,
if anyone
definitely.
like this one, this is the one you have to go with. And thank you, Alex, for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Petra, for hosting as well. Dr. Ramirez for sharing with us. We really appreciate that.
Right. So thank you. Bye.